inviting me today. I'm actually really looking forward to sharing some thoughts about how we work at Condé Nast and some of the challenges we face as a global company. And I want to thank the team for actually organising and inviting me today. So it's a privilege to talk to you. And I noticed many people from around the world, which is truly exciting. I'm Australian, so I also love the reference to Julia Gillard. That is an incredible talk about her role as Prime Minister in Australia and the misogyny that she had to deal with. And I'm currently based in Spain. So it's unfortunately raining outside in Madrid, but truly global conversation. So I'm going to kick off. So if I share my screen and then tell me if you can see my presentation.
We can, Mel. Thank you.
Good, perfect. Okay, fantastic. So what I'm going to talk about today is strategy in the context of making and how we tend to think about it at Condé Nast, but also throughout my experience working in digital strategy and technology and implementation of products and services globally, how I think I've reflected on the role and how we can produce and launch things at scale quickly. And we're going to do that in the context of puzzles explored as mysteries. So a little bit about me. My role, I am the VP of Product at Condé Nast. You may have heard of us before, but we are a global company based out of, I think, 12 owned and operated countries, and of which we have 26 licensee markets. My role is the VP of Product across consumer brands and commerce. What that means is that I handle the integration and the globalization of our digital properties across Vogue, GQ, Condé Nast Traveller, Architectural Digest, Allure, and Glamour. We also have in the portfolio brands like The New Yorker, Wired, and Vanity Fair. And so it's a really diverse organisation. We cover anything from, hardcore long form journalism through subscription products like The New Yorker and Wired. Vogue needs no introduction and operates in 26 markets globally. And some brands that are specifically in the US, but, offer incredibly good service is a brand like Allure in 2 markets, but actually is one of the leading kind of beauty brands editorial globally. The other part of my job is to look at our baby of the monetization strategies that we have in the organisation. We're still primarily an ads-led business. We have a very strong and viable subscriptions and membership portfolio, but commerce is growing really fast. And that can be anything from affiliate, dropship, or other monetization models. So that's my day job. It's what I spend a lot of my time chained to the computer and looking at how we globalize, particularly as we bring the organisation together. Up until 2 years ago, it was, well, in fact, 3 years ago, it was 12 separate companies. About 2 years ago, it became 2. So an international business and the US business, and now it is truly integrating as a global company. The other part that is interesting, but is relevant to this conversation today, is that I'm actually a trained artist and photographer. It did not used to be relevant to my career, and I kept them quite separate. But as I go through the learnings about what it is to be an artist, I apply a lot of those frameworks and technologies and processes to how we do strategy. And then the final part is I'm a nomad. What that means is I think I was a digital nomad before it became a term, but have travelled and lived around the world. What that has taught me, having worked a lot around Europe, is the importance of diversity and culture. And that, more Anglo-American ways of working don't necessarily apply as you apply that out in a global context. And is something that if you've never worked truly globally, is a kind of learning that most organisations or individuals go through. And one of my first experiences of that was working for TUI and having to work in and out of Stockholm for about 6 months, and the rapid fire education of working in a Nordic environment. So what am I going to talk about today? It's broken down into a story in 4 chapters. I'm hoping to weave a variety of threads. They're not necessarily designed to be linear. It's a few kind of things to drop ideas into your frame of reference, and then questions at the end. So it's around strategy, people, outcomes, and actually curiosity. So here we go. So the first thing is that strategy is nourished by patience. There is a book, and I reference the reference materials at the end, called The Messy Middle. Scott Belsky Creative Behance, if anyone uses it, which was bought by Adobe, but was a creative community for artists and designers and illustrators to share their work. And the really key thing about strategy, and I am guilty of forgetting this too, is that it takes time. It takes time to take that really small seed of an idea and grow it into a tree, grow it into something that you didn't imagine it before. But even if you know that you are growing something, and I'll use the metaphor of a tree, how it evolves, how it grows its branches is not as you would imagine. And so the final sort of output and its ongoing growth, even though it is still structurally a tree, will be something that you never imagined. And it goes back to, in terms of when you're looking at strategy, that it takes a long time of iteration and a real commitment to getting there. And that's what he called the messy middle, right? It's something that actually artists and creatives are often very comfortable sitting in that space between the unknown and the known. But for certain sort of parts of industry, certain disciplines, it's a very uncomfortable space to be when you want structure, when you want outcomes, and when you want next steps. But the patience is to stick it out. If you know that you're heading in the right direction and you can take your organization on that path, you will truly implement the thing that you imagined in the first place. And so I start with this context, which is lovely in the context of International Women's Day. So 3 years ago, I was in New York. I had just started at Condé Nast. I had had a very frustrating day at work. I was actually having a glass of wine with a colleague, kind of wondering why I was being so challenged in terms of trying to, implement new things. It was primarily to do with the fact that it was the first time I was working in an American and primarily New York culture. As we were walking through the Oculus Center, which is underneath the World Trade Center, we saw this mobile sculpture and hanging. And at this perspective, we were both like, what is this? This makes no sense. It's like ugly. It's kind of interfering with this beautiful sculptural building. And as we walked through it, we turned around and this is what it actually said. And what it was actually a campaign for International Women's Day or Women's Month around equal pay. So what it actually is currencies from around the world with actually the faces of women from those cultures. But the key point about this piece of art is about perspective. And it goes back to the detail of being inside of your strategy and having that long range altitude of understanding your North Star. That unless you have the perspective to stand back, you can often get lost in the weeds. You can't really see what you're doing and why. This is often the criticism that often people on the ground will give leadership when they're asking why are they doing something, because they can't see the altitude that you're operating in. And it is our responsibility as leaders to basically show the path of where they're to go, to give them that altitude and that perspective. To change requires doing things differently. It also requires to stand back and allowing people to absorb all the different messages into one. And I love this as a reminder because I had to step back and remind myself that I had jumped to conclusions. I had made a judgment. This is going to work. Why is this ugly? And as I walked away, I was reminded that, change actually takes time and it takes perspective. So where does change come into your strategy? It is the space between what is old and what is new. You need a compass and you need a map, and that path is never clear, with both mysteries and puzzles to solve. So while you will have a roadmap and everyone will ask you for dates and everyone will ask you for the final destination, like any traveler, there will be pivots. There'll be things that you have to navigate that you did not foresee when you started on this adventure. It also involves doing things differently and leaving the old behind and doing the opposite of what you have imagined. And that is one of the challenges with strategy and convincing and getting people on board to something that they are not familiar with. So the best thing, well, not the best thing, one of the most interesting things about the pandemic was the speed of change. It was no longer a white paper. It was no longer a conversation with a small group of people about digital nomadism. It became a core reality for the majority of the population that can work remotely. Now, that could have taken years or decades, but it had been an idea that was seeding in certain industries, particularly tech. But it does involve, and so we were given an external event, effectively a black swan, to basically change our thinking. As a leader, your job and our role as part of delivering a strategy is navigating and creating serendipity in the workplace to allow change to seed. And it's something that can be really hard and challenging when you're dealing with different, people and personalities and ways of working. So it starts with a vision. And starting with something new means you have to imagine something that never existed before. Think about it when you're buying a house or when you're trying to renovate, planning a wedding, buying a car, going on a holiday. It starts with a seed of an idea. I want to go and change my whole life and go live in another country. You have to imagine the end game. You don't know how it fully will be, but you have to actually then backtrack all the steps that you need to take. But if you don't have that vision or you don't have that idea in your head, you can't change what you can't see. This is where creativity does actually come into play. A spreadsheet will only tell you one thing: how you're going to make money, how you're going to make profit. That is the rational alignment. I need to hit a certain amount of revenue, a certain amount of conversion to basically make a company profitable. But vision comes from emotions. It comes from the passion and belief that what we are doing is the right path to follow. If you need an organization of 7,000 or even 20 people to follow and believe and work and stretch and grow themselves, they have to believe that it's worth it, because ultimately we're human, right? And if we don't believe, then we will put up roadblocks as individuals and as teams and as organizations. If you are fundamentally, like we are at the moment, trying to reimagine Condé, we have to tell the story, and it is a narrative about where we're trying to go. And it isn't just about spreadsheets. So there are two types of things that we're trying to solve. One is a puzzle and one is a mystery. So the easiest things to do in a strategy is to understand a puzzle, and note that not all strategy at a business level. We may have a strategy on a technology level to just migrate a variety of websites. We may have an operational strategy to optimize costs. The interesting and the simple thing about puzzles is they can be solved, right? It's a formula, it's a framework, it's a series of building blocks, it's tactics. They always have an answer. So when we're looking at things from a program perspective or even an implementation, you are solving a puzzle, right? But the challenge is you cannot solve a mystery through a puzzle, right? If you apply the techniques of getting all the pieces and putting them all in place, you're missing the beauty of the mystery. And the thing about mysteries is that the answer is not known. It is the combination of factors between known and unknown, and they can only be framed, right? So they're framed in the context of a question, and they can be interacted based on past knowledge, future knowledge, and where we need to go. So the interesting thing is when we start is asking the question, first one, are we solving a puzzle or are we solving a mystery? And this is where it comes to the joy of being a traveler, right? The serendipity of not knowing where you're going to go. If you may know your final destination and you know that you have to drive from point A to point B, you're not really clear what might happen in that journey. So we search not for better answers, but actually and fundamentally, and the more and more I think about it, and I've actually given this talk 3 times, twice internally to Condé, and I see it even more now on the day-to-day. If you ask the wrong question, you will always get the wrong answer. And so the inputs, the framing, and how we investigate this path and this puzzle and mystery we're trying to solve is as crucial as the outcomes we are trying to drive. So let's think about the question. It is the single most important part of our strategy and our brief, because it really determines and frames the intended result. So can we pose the question in a different way, and can we reframe? So are we solving for problems versus opportunities? Semantics really matter, and it matters even more so when you're thinking about foreign, language or teams where English is not the first language, or whereby in a context where the usage of those words means different things. One of my favorite, I have 2 sort of joys in language. One is the nuances between, say, Australian and British and South African and Americans of the English language. And being in Spain, where I don't speak fluently, but always understanding and having people translate the nuance of language and how colourful a language it is and how it is used to define certain things. English language is not so much the same. And so this reframing is really important, right? We could get a brief from our management or from our team. How do we create a £50 million business over 5 years? That is a very rational question. It often requires you to solve a puzzle, you backtrack, you look at audience, you look at conversion, you look at all the building blocks that would make give you the answer to that question. But what if we reframe? And this was a brief I was given when I built Telegraph Travel in the UK, and took it from a 20 million to a 50 million business actually in 2 years. It was not our intention. The plan was 5, but we did it in 2. We reframed that question into how do we get more customers traveling, and how do we make it easy and inspirational? And then how do we monetize it? In the context of, say, Condé Nast, is that how do I pivot my brand from a reader-led to a consumer-led proposition before I get to the 50 million? Or how do I really meet the needs of our consumers right now in the context of the behavior that they're looking at? So travel's a really interesting sector at the moment. Most people would say that people are not traveling. That is actually not true. Our brand Condé Nast Traveller is having the highest traffic it's ever had. The questions have changed though. What they're looking for has changed, and their needs have changed. The desire to travel has never actually changed. So I'm going to frame it in an example. And this is a Zaha Hadid building in Macau. It is the Morpheus Hotel. And to look at the framing of the question, I don't actually know what the brief was that was given for this hotel, but it would have been to create a building with 4 walls, in the style, you know, with some sort of flavour of the local culture. And this is the result. So while it is structurally a building with 4 walls, and it has an interior, and it has rooms, and it has restaurants, and it has elevators, and all the functional and structural things that you would require in a hotel, it has inspiration that is completely disconnected from architecture. So the first one is that it uses the figure 8 in the centre, which is a measure of good luck in Chinese. This is also a casino. So it's referencing, you know, the idea of luck comes from numerology and all the other aspects of Chinese astrology. The second part is that the design and the aesthetic of the building is referencing how jade is made in a natural context. And the beauty of that is that it comes through in terms of this building. So as an architect, where you have to follow very structural foundations, and it is a puzzle to unlock how you build it, and it would have started with a sketch and a blueprint and a set of foundations. It was envisaged and dreamed of as an artist, right? It is something that you could have not possibly imagined through your own eyes, but obviously Zaha Hadid is one of the most incredible architects of the last 100 years, because she pushes the boundaries of what a building could, should do, and what it says about a place that it inhabits. And so it curves, and it feels more like a form that's evolved out of the ground rather than actually a building. So part 1, strategy. The difference between mysteries and puzzles, right, is actually really understanding the rules of the things you need to solve for, and then breaking them like an artist. So part 2, moving into people. So in the digital world, we are now completely and utterly driven by algorithm. Algorithms tend to choose what we read. It influences politics and debate. And it is the cornerstone of almost all technology builds at the moment. But what is really interesting, and particularly when you work again in a content space where a lot of what we do is based on intuition, is that those that can get back to and outside of an algorithmic decision will actually win in the future. What do I mean by that? I don't want the same recommendations on Netflix over and over again. Just because I watch one documentary on a certain topic doesn't mean I want 50 others. Where is the serendipitous moment that gives me a piece of content or something I had never expected that may change my belief in something, may change my learning, or even introduce me to something I've never heard of before? I do that at my goal, and one of my little personal challenges is often to try and break the algorithm. And I do that with social conversations with my friends. My favorite part of the week is Monday morning when Spotify gives me my playlist for the week. When it starts to get really familiar and really generic, as in I'm getting the same type of music over and over again, to break my own habits and that of the music that I am being given, I ask other people with very disconnected music tastes to share me their playlists, to basically feed the algorithm to break the kind of trends that it's giving. Because what an algorithm will do will only give me past behavior. It will not give me future. And I think is an interesting conversation as we go into technology about understanding and predicting future needs of a consumer rather than past. So this comes from knowing your people. Semantics drive the opportunity space. Like I said before with the question that you ask fundamentally determines the research that you look for. So if I'm in a publishing organization and I'm looking at reader behavior, or I'm looking at audience behavior or viewer behavior, so video, consumption and articles, then I'm only going to look for passive opportunities. When you move into commerce, you do get the word consumer, not a great word in terms of consumption, or a user, not necessarily also a positive word, but it does change the space of the information that you will look for. Inputs matter just as much as outputs. And so one of the things I ask the teams at the moment at Condé is to reframe who the audience is. Who are they? Where are they? What are their attitudes? And most importantly, what and how do they make decisions? In publishing, it's not a common question because it's considered a very passive experience. Watching television used to be a passive experience. Now, while I think research has got very good at understanding those questions, this is not a new industry or a practice or a ways of working. But what is often missed is the intended outcome for the consumer or for your reader. And even if you're reading an article or something on the New York Times or something in the New Yorker, it is about understanding and knowledge, right? So the outcome is to be better informed. The outcome is to be, have a knowledge base to talk to your friends around the dinner table or the Zoom, chat. But understanding your audience and what they are doing always has an activity attached to it, which is understanding the why, right? Not just the outcome they're driving, but why are they seeking that information? Is it to be knowledgeable? Is it to make a decision? Is it to purchase a product? And one of the frameworks, and it is just one of many, in a product world, it's called jobs to be done. In a consumer experience, it might be a customer journey map. It can be applied in many ways, but the way that I like to frame it is a job and jobs also can be quite rational. I like it just the tasks to be done, but again, it's semantics. But if you Google it, you can find, a great wealth of information. But the interesting thing at its most simple is that it is a job. It doesn't change over time. It doesn't have any geographical boundaries. It's solution agnostic. It has a universal structure, and all jobs are ultimately processes. So I'll give you an example. We have a constant and repetitive conversation that the travel needs in every market is different. An Indian traveller, a Spanish traveller, a British traveller, and an American traveller are fundamentally different. But actually, I would argue that they are not, right? So in travel, and I'll put it in the context of 50 years ago. So I was at Christmas time and I was in Australia and I picked up a guidebook, which was the Frommer's Guide to Europe on $5 a day. And in that book, it does very simple things: where to go, where to stay, what to do, and what the price of everything is. What is fascinating is that about 50% of those places still exist today. I picked out Madrid. The way that the guidebook references Madrid is still very similar to how we might talk about the city today. And the information that you would now find on a TripAdvisor, on a Condé Nast Traveller is fundamentally the same. It hasn't changed over time. It's where to go, where to stay, what to do, and what's the price. So what is different is not actually the processes that the consumer or the traveller is doing in any of the markets at the moment. Doesn't matter whether you're Indian, Spanish, French, German, American, British. You are asking very specific questions at the moment. Can I leave my country? If I can, where can I go? Can I even get on a plane? And therefore, where can I stay and what are the risks associated? So safety has now become a really key part of travel. But the desire to travel has not changed. The desire to go somewhere has not changed. What has actually changed is the destination and the mode of transport. Nothing more, nothing less. We still want to take that 3-hour week break for a weekend away. It's just now, if you're in the UK, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get on the Eurostar and go to Paris. In fact, you really can't leave the UK. But most people, when they can, they will drive 3 hours in a car to the destination they can get to. So it's really important to understand that jobs don't change. They never have. What has changed is the technology, the solutions, and the information we give them. And in this context, we can be method researchers, creators, product people, writers. You can be an audience, a viewer, a reader, a user, a consumer, or a customer. If anyone in this group is working in UX, it's often the counter to that. Understand your users. You must interview everybody. You must understand what they're doing fundamentally, because there'll be things you will not know. But like an editor, we would never hire someone to be an editor of Vogue or an editor of Condé Nast Traveler who didn't live and breathe the industry. And I know when I'm hiring and recruiting people, particularly on the brand side, it's one of the first questions, we ask. We're not going to hire someone to work in product on the New Yorker if they don't fundamentally care about the craft of that brand. And vice versa. You want to work on Vogue, then having a real passion for the fashion industry and the content we produce also helps us create a better product for our readers and consumers and customers. So this goes back to rechanneling some of our information. If we understand our consumers and we understand everything that we're doing for them, we can then start to craft experiences for them. And note that I will say, and I say this again with my teams, what opportunity are we solving for both the business and the customer? In product, we often use the word problem or pain point. And yes, in a UX perspective, there are lots of problems and pain points. I can't register, I can't log in. That is the rational part of product. But ultimately, the opportunity is something different. How do I get people to learn more about American politics? How do I get people to understand, and know what's going on with the Oscars? And how do we get more people traveling? When you reframe that question, ultimately the answer will be different. So going into two sections, outcomes and then curiosity. We'll go into the rational first. While I sit with two hats on, both a rational and a creative, the quality of the outcome is, and I've mentioned this before, is fundamentally derived from input in and input out. These are if we want to drive an outcome, we can have a certain element of metrics that can give us perspectives, but it will fundamentally also be changed by what we learn along the way. And so it's really important that we are making sure that the inputs, think of it like a recipe. Anyone can take the same set of ingredients and make a cake and make a roast. But the beauty of the craft is knowing all those little things that you tweak around the edges to create that absolutely melt in your mouth recipe and product. I'm not a great cook. I wish I had the patience. But ultimately, the quality of the outcome is fundamentally derived by how much I put in, how much time and how much craft I add to the experience to then ultimately get an output out. It's one of the joys of going back into a publishing and ultimately creative business is that the craft becomes just as important. You work in a utility-based digital where it's all about utility and function and performance. That creativity doesn't feel so prevalent. The next part is constraints. Really important. Again, in an agile world, we feel we can get into quite repetitive. We have to be agile, we have to be lean, it doesn't matter, we will go really fast. But ultimately, if you don't know your North Star, you could be building something for a year and not know that you're on the right path. And one of the things that I love is constraints drive decisions, right? And having a decision framework in your processes that helps you structure your puzzles and looking at it in a very project mindset of time, cost, and quality. I'll use a reference to publishing from 100 years ago. We have a lovely archive in Condé Nast where you can see all the magazines going back to the very first edition of Vogue. In a variety of them, we can see the actual where advertising actually comes from. So advertising works in the context of if you need to produce something on the right-hand side, it has a cost associated. Therefore, on the left-hand side, you need a percentage of ads that basically cover the cost of production. So this is an Irving Penn photograph. It basically has, at every single page of the magazine, has a reference to what page it was, what the photographer was charged, what the model was charged, what all the costs were associated. And this, believe it or not, was a $500 photograph. And so from an advertising perspective, you knew you had to, fund the cost of the magazine for all the versions of this. Digital advertising actually works fundamentally the same. So it's jobs to be done, right? The role of advertising is to cover the cost of production as opposed to commerce or other forms of monetization. And these decisions also then craft how much you will spend on a photographer, how much you will spend on a model and how much you will spend on all the other beautiful things that you want to add to that image. It also then links to measurement, no different to change management. You can't measure what you can't see. You can't change what you can't see. So having really clear objectives and key results to make sure that you're navigating. So this is a full bleed out of a photographic page from one of the magazines, and understanding both your incremental and your long-term goals. And this goes to very financial language, which, you know, I find fascinating, I struggle with, but also, you know, is a really fundamental, because it's how businesses work, because it's how you create profit, is around your leading and your lagging indicators. It is interesting in the world of, say, digital content and product. A lot of people don't know these indicators, so it's very hard for them to even justify the work that they're doing if they don't understand the metrics that they're looking at. So leading metrics are really important, but they will only tell you today, and they will only tell you, like an algorithm, the information that is in front of you. So if we're measuring Architectural Digest and wondering why it's not growing, and constantly looking at our own Google Analytics and constantly looking inward, we are missing the shift of behavior with our consumer. It is actually what happened on Condé Nast Traveller. The moment that the pandemic hit, so literally 2 days from now in Spain on March the 10th, traffic dropped 40%. And it was a mad scramble between the audience development teams, editorial, and they kept producing more of the same content because the data was telling them that this time last year that content was performing. So it's all the metrics, whether it's advertising, CPM, CPV, EPC, just, you know, an acronym, and an acronym. And ultimately what we had to do is that we said, right, let's look through our social listening tools, so a completely different set of dashboards, and look at where the conversation has moved to, because clearly what we're writing about isn't actually working. By doing that, we were able to see 2 or 3 important conversations that were happening not just on our competitors' websites, but actually in the travel space. And it was primarily around what I talked about before. The desire to travel hadn't changed, but the locations had, the safety had, and all those questions. When the brand pivoted to writing content of that nature, within 2 months, they were ahead, and if not now, ahead of their targets. And they are now working that way, and it's been really good to actually train them. I think it would have taken a year to get this team to understand that shift in behavior. Now they don't have a choice. When traffic drops, they go and look to where the conversation has moved to, and they create. They also are now leading in that conversation in a way that they weren't before, because people can come to us for trusted advice. Then you get your bigger picture goals. So when the aggregation of all of that can show you your roll up over a year, but they don't predict the future. So it gives you where your growth is coming. It doesn't really factor in external factors like a pandemic, but can give you projections on your profit and your growth over time. Which gives us to an element of data blindness. It is very easy to hide behind data. It is fundamental to everything that we do, but it is only one piece of our puzzle, right? It is not the only piece of the puzzle and cannot be seen in isolation. With my teams, if they give me one data point, it's basically not acceptable, in the sense of you need to put 3 or 4 together. If I'm looking at my current analytics, I'm looking at future trends, I'm looking at consumer and audience behavior. My job as the creative or the artist or the product leader is to put them all together to actually pinpoint that piece of information that we need. Because sometimes, and this is again the beauty of an editorial brand, is that instinct goes a long way. The reason why our editors are at the forefront of what they do is because they really know the pulse of the industry and the sectors they work in, and they set the conversation. So the last part, creative curiosity. Collaborative thinking. In a world that is digital, everyone actually has both the opportunity and I would say the requirement to be creative. We can get very heads down. Think of that change picture at the beginning where you're so focused on the now, you haven't taken a step back. One of the best pieces of advice is a previous CEO boss of mine gave me, it was actually making sure that I scheduled into my time, thinking time. And I think that, you know, a variety of leaders have talked about that in their normal day-to-day, they actually build thinking time into their work, reading articles, going on these bizarre explorations, reading about topics that actually don't feel like they are connected to their work. I was not doing that 3 or 4 years ago and basically suffered a burnout because I was so into the detail. Now it's a core part of my day because it actually feeds into ideas and thought processes that I can take back into the organisation. And I encourage the teams, it doesn't matter whether you're an engineer or a finance analyst, you can spot something that someone else may miss. So it goes to the point of this talk, which is strategy by making. And it's something that I wish we did more of, because unfortunately a lot of strategists are financial people, they are numbers people. You know, it's not until, you know, a board deck is done that it often comes to the creatives or the thinkers into the organisation to actually problem solve. But I keep pushing back at the moment now because it is something I learned in art school, which is that you show, don't tell. And it goes back to, if you can imagine the future, then people will follow. We are ultimately visual and audio and visceral creatures. We respond to the things we see. So it's prototypes, not PowerPoint. It's the art of the possible through the imagination, and it's bringing those ideas to life. Advertising, ad companies and design companies do it very well. They concept pitch. Even though the thing they concept may not be the final outcome, they get you to imagine what it would be like to work with them. Because solving customer problems is not only rational, but is rational, so that I have a problem, right? But actually an opportunity is actually about inspiring customers, and that is emotional. This is actually Irving Penn's visual diary. One of the few things I couldn't touch, and in the Condé archive, it is truly an incredible thing. And if you are a photographer or any kind of creative, it's basically your workbook. It's where you seek to get inspiration for your own ideas. And all that it is was examples and cutouts of poses, of lighting, of other people that he was inspired by, but forms the foundation of a lot of his future work. So narratives, not spreadsheets. People remember and share stories, both the positive and the negative. If you are trying to change an organisation, if the pervasive narrative in your organisation is we can't do that, then you won't succeed. You have to convince people to believe in something that didn't exist before, and you have to take those numbers and make it into a vision and a reality that people can create. That is where the craft of design comes in. So it's about your imagination. Stop wandering and wondering, the joys of the unknown and the art of non-doing, the seemingly unconnected, to create something that is connected. There's a moment where all, like those ingredients, right? If you start with a recipe, there will be 10 ingredients, and it's not until the alchemy of putting them all together do you create the final product. Do you create that painting? Do you create those words on a page? Those words on a page linked to an article, linked to a visual story, have all come together to inspire the person that is consuming it. And that comes through serendipity, right? It is not talked about in business. A traveler will do it by nature, right? It's bringing all these random smells and environments and things that take you off center to make you experience something new. Two parts to the creative brain, no different to product. One is the logical. We are a brain of choice. Is this the better decision to make versus another one? We do think in a linear fashion. If I do this task, if I put this ingredients in and I wait 20 minutes, then something else will happen, and then I do the next task. Working on principles. That is the structure of a successful business, is the heartbeat of how an organisation works. Having those foundations at play allows you to become the inventor, to put those odd things together, to make connections that may not have been there before, like the Zaha Hadid building. Who would have thought to put jade carving, the number 8 and a hotel together? Curious people take risks. They allow themselves to get productively distracted. So just to wrap up, and I'll try and put some, well, I will put some structure around it. Strategy in traveling can be really brutal. It goes back to, it takes time and it takes patience, and it's about bringing all those things together. And I take that from, you know, a travel kind of narrative around kind of going on an exploration. Oops, forgot that moved. So here are some key takeaways, very simply. I started in the beginning talking about puzzles and mysteries and how you reframe the question. Simple as that. Are we asking the right question as a group before we start? Become that method creator and designer. Live and breathe the thing you're trying to create, because you will understand the pain points as well as the opportunities by being part of that ideation. In one of my old companies, we made a physical product. That was the thing, was our bread and butter. It was PhotoBox. Every fortnight, or sorry, once a month in our team, we would all make a version of that product and then talk about the experience as a group. Not only was it a brilliant team building exercise, but it really helped us understand the problems as well as the opportunities we were trying to create. You have to mash up your ideas, your data, and your insights, input in all the things that craft to help you get to the output. Then you focus on delivery. Then you map the puzzle and the steps to get there. In an old way of looking at it, and this is what many people do, it's the kind of backbone of companies, right? You set some goals, then you do some research, then you brainstorm, and then you may come up with a strategy, although you may have done it before, and then you brainstorm the solution, then you design, and then you test, and then you release. Very linear. Even in an agile way of working, it is how most companies work. Top down, from the management, all the way down into delivery. My question to you all was, what if you reframed it? It is not an easy process. Teams can struggle with it. You need to have a lot of foundational trust to be able to allow for the messy middle. But doing brainstorming, strategy, testing, goal setting, research, and design at the same time is how all those ingredients come together to make that final cake. So these were, I'll give you 3 books that you want to read. And I think they're available in most languages. I know that my team's checked, definitely not in Russian apparently. But The Messy Middle by Scott Belsky, in terms of the framework of how creatives of any kind work, and that's sitting in that space in the middle. I Cannot Take Credit for Puzzles and Mysteries. It comes from a book called Curious, The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depends on It. It is a fascinating sociological and anthropological book about how our brains deal with curiosity. I did not realize there's about 6 different ways that our brain approaches that concept. And in a business context, Imagine It Forward from Beth Comstock, who was the CMO at GM globally, and basically talks about both the struggle and the opportunity and the innovation that was brought into GM by bringing in these kind of creative practices. And that is it. Thank you for listening.